the night the sky fell over Kansas, the 1955 tornado that shocked the American heartland. On May 25, 1955, the sky fell over Kansas, not as a metaphor, not as a distant memory, but as a roaring, spinning column of destruction that would erase an entire town from the map in less than 3 minutes. This is the story of Udall, a town of 600 souls nestled in the quiet farmlands of southern Kansas, where neighbors knew each other by name, where children rode bicycles down dusty streets, and where the sound of a train whistle meant the day was ending, not that death was arriving. But on that Wednesday night, the train whistle would be replaced by something far more terrifying, a sound that survivors would never forget, a roar so deep, so overwhelming that it seemed to come from the earth itself, and when it was over, the heartland of America would never be the same. Chapter 1. The Last Ordinary Day. The morning of May 25, 1955, began like any other in Udall, Kansas. The sun rose early over the flat wheat fields, casting long shadows across the single main street. Roosters crowed from backyard coops. Screen doors creaked open as men headed to work in the oil fields, and women prepared breakfast for families still rubbing sleep from their eyes. 12-year-old Gary Atkinson woke up early that morning. He had a job to do. Every afternoon, Gary delivered the Winfield Courier newspaper to most of the 600 residents of his hometown. It was a simple task that took him up and down every street, past every porch, through every alley. He knew the town like the back of his hand. He knew which dogs would bark and which ones would wag their tails. He knew which elderly neighbors would offer him a cookie and which ones would simply wave from behind their curtains. Gary preferred delivering papers to working at his parents' grocery store. The store was small and cramped, filled with the smells of flour and salted meat. But out on his bicycle he was free, the wind in his hair, the sun on his face, the endless Kansas sky above him. That morning, Gary ate breakfast with his family. His father, Bobby Sr., sat at the head of the table, reading the very newspaper his son would later deliver. His mother, Nina, poured coffee and reminded the boys to finish their eggs. Gary's older brother, Bobby Jr., was 17 and already dreaming of a life beyond Udall. His younger brother, Stanley, was just 9 years old, full of energy and questions about everything. It was a normal morning, the kind of morning that happens in small towns across America, the kind of morning that nobody remembers unless something terrible follows. Across town, in a small house near the railroad tracks, Earl Rowe was preparing for his shift. Earl was the mayor of Udall, but being mayor of a town this small did not pay the bills. So Earl worked as a driller on an oil rig, pulling long night shifts that left him exhausted but provided for his family. That evening he would head out to the rig as the sun set. He had no idea that by the time he returned, there would be no town left to govern. At the community building downtown, a group of women were setting up for a wedding shower. Alan Kistler and Beth Evans, both 15 years old, were among the guests. They laughed and gossiped as they arranged flowers and folded napkins. The bride-to-be was glowing with happiness. The room was filled with the sounds of celebration. Life, in all its ordinary beauty, was unfolding as it always did. And in the small telephone exchange office, Mary Ellen Taylor prepared for her evening shift. Mary Ellen was 63 years old, a widow who had dedicated her life to connecting the people of Udall to one another. She sat at her switchboard, plugging and unplugging cables, routing calls from farms to businesses to homes. She was the voice that answered when you lifted the receiver, the calm presence that connected you to help when you needed it most. That afternoon, Gary Atkinson climbed onto his bicycle and began his paper route. He pedaled past the grain elevators that towered over Main Street, past the First Methodist Church, past the one-room schoolhouse where he had learned to read. He tossed newspapers onto porches with practiced precision, waving to neighbors who called out his name. The sky was clear. The air was warm. May in Kansas meant storms, but the day had been peaceful. There was no reason to worry. By late afternoon, the first hints of trouble appeared far to the south. In Oklahoma, a massive storm system was brewing. Meteorologists in Wichita noted the developing weather, but in 1955, the science of tornado prediction was in its infancy. Weather radar was primitive. Communication systems were slow. The word tornado itself had been banned from official forecasts until just a few years earlier, for fear of causing public panic. 2 severe weather warnings were issued that afternoon, but the process of relaying information was cumbersome. Warnings had to travel from Kansas City to Denver before reaching local radio and television stations in Wichita. By the time the message arrived, it was often too late. As the sun began to set over Udall, The sky to the southwest turned an unusual shade of green. Old-timers knew that color. They had seen it before. It meant trouble. But the 10 o'clock news gave the all clear. The forecasters said the danger had passed. They were wrong. At approximately 9:30 that evening, a monstrous tornado touched down near Blackwell, Oklahoma, about 40 miles to the southwest. This was not an ordinary storm. It was a Category F5, the most powerful classification on the Fujita scale. Winds exceeded 300 miles per hour. The tornado tore through Blackwell with devastating force, destroying buildings, overturning vehicles, and taking 20 lives in a matter of minutes. But the storm was not finished. The same supercell that had spawned the Blackwell tornado continued to churn as it moved northeast, crossing into Kansas. About 30 minutes after the first tornado dissipated, another began to form. This one was even larger, even more powerful, and it was heading directly for Udall. At 10:20 p.m., the first signs of the approaching storm reached the town. The wind began to howl. Hail clattered against windows like 1,000 tiny hammers. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The town of Udall was plunged into darkness. In the community building, the wedding shower guests looked at each other with growing concern. The sound of the wind was unlike anything they had ever heard. It was not a whistle. It was not a moan. It was a roar, deep and primal and absolutely terrifying. Beth Evans had planned to go across the street to work the night shift at the telephone exchange, but her mother had told her no. Something about the weather did not feel right. Stay here, her mother had said, stay with us. It was a decision that would save her life. At 10:35 p.m., the tornado struck Udall. It came from the southwest, a massive column of spinning destruction wrapped in rain and darkness. There were no sirens. There was no warning. Motorists on the highway reported seeing the funnel illuminated by lightning strikes, a terrifying silhouette against the night sky. But for the residents of Udall, there was only the sound, that horrible, unforgettable roar. The tornado struck the southwest corner of town first and traveled northeast, cutting directly through the heart of the community. The entire width of destruction was 3/4 of a mile. Almost nothing was spared. In 3 minutes, it was over. But the nightmare was just beginning. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because in the stories we tell here, we don't just recount tragedies, we honor the memory of those who lived them. We remind the world that history is not just facts and dates. It's the lives of real people, ordinary people, who faced extraordinary moments. Subscribe, because their stories deserve to be remembered. Chapter 2. 3 Minutes of Eternity. The Atkinson family had just gone to bed when the storm arrived. Bobby Jr., 17 years old, was lying in his room trying to sleep. The house was old but sturdy, built to withstand the Kansas weather, or so they thought. When the water cooler on the porch was suddenly blown across the room, Bobby knew something was terribly wrong. He heard his father shouting, his mother screaming for the children, and then the walls began to shake. The windows exploded inward. The roof lifted off, like the lid of a jar being twisted open. And then the house was gone, just simply gone. Bobby was thrown through the air. Debris pelted his body with incredible force. Later, he would describe the sensation as being shot in the back with a shotgun over and over again, while someone else hit him in the head with a hammer. He did not know where he was. He did not know which way was up. He only knew pain. When the tornado passed, Bobby found himself lying in a field. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating a landscape that he could not recognize. Where was his house? Where was his family? Where was he? He tried to stand but collapsed. Both of his arms were broken. Several ribs were fractured. His skull was cracked, and protruding from his back was a 2x2 wooden board that had been driven partially through his body. Bobby crawled. For 7 hours he crawled through the wreckage, searching for his family, searching for help, searching for anything that made sense. The rain continued to fall. The darkness remained absolute, and all around him he could hear the sounds of suffering, moaning, crying, screaming for help. His 12-year-old brother Gary was dead. His 9-year-old brother Stanley was dead. His mother Nina would die from her injuries a few days later. His father would survive for 6 months before succumbing to his wounds and the cancer that had been slowly consuming him. A family of 5 became a family of 1. In the community building downtown, the wedding shower guests had managed to survive. The building was damaged but standing. Aline Kistler remembered the moment she thought she was going to meet her end. The ceiling panels began to tear away, whipping into the night sky. The walls trembled, the sound was deafening, And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tornado was gone. The group of 15 people who had gathered for a celebration emerged into a world they did not recognize. Main Street was gone. The buildings they had known their entire lives were gone. The grain elevators that had towered over the town were gone. The water tower that had been a landmark for decades was toppled, and everywhere, in every direction, there was destruction. Wheeler Martin, another survivor, had heard the roaring noise at about 10:20. He had gone outside to investigate when the hail began. The wind was from the southwest and growing stronger. After a few minutes, his house began to shake, and then it collapsed. He emerged from the rubble with cuts and bruises, but he was alive. Many of his neighbors were not so fortunate. The telephone exchange office, where Mary Ellen Taylor had been working, was completely destroyed. Mary Ellen had stayed at her post until the very end, trying to connect emergency calls, trying to warn people, trying to do her job. When the tornado struck, the building disintegrated around her. She never had a chance. Her body would be found in the wreckage the next morning. Beth Evans, the teenager who had planned to work that night shift, learned of Mary Ellen's passing the following day. If her mother had not told her to stay at the wedding shower, she would have been sitting right next to Mary Ellen when the building was torn apart. Fate is a strange and mysterious thing. Across town, vehicles had been thrown hundreds of yards and mangled beyond recognition. One pickup truck was found wrapped around a tree, stripped of everything but its frame and tires. The image would become one of the most iconic photographs of the disaster, a testament to the incredible power of nature. A concrete block building, about 30 by 40 feet, had been standing in the southwest part of town. It was completely obliterated. All four walls had fallen outward, leaving the floor area relatively clear of debris. It was as if the building had exploded from the inside. The Udall Public School sustained major damage. Beams were snapped and blown away. Windows were shattered. Classrooms where children had learned to read and write just hours before were now open to the sky. 170 homes were destroyed. 192 buildings were wiped from the map. The bank remained standing. The post office survived. One small business on the edge of town was spared. Everything else was gone. The death toll would eventually reach 82. More than 270 people were injured. That meant that nearly 70% of the population of Udall had been either harmed or taken in a single night. And as the survivors began to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened, they realized a terrible truth. Help was not coming. Not yet. The rest of the world did not even know what had occurred. Chapter 3. The Silence After the Storm. In the darkness that followed the tornado, the people of Udall were alone. The power was out. The telephone lines were down. The roads into town were blocked by debris. There were no sirens because there were no emergency services. There were no flashing lights because there were no vehicles capable of responding. In 1955, the infrastructure for disaster response that we take for granted today simply did not exist. There was no 911 to call. There was no National Guard on standby. There was no protocol for mass casualty events in rural Kansas. And so the survivors did what survivors have always done. They helped each other. Men who had been thrown from their beds stumbled through the wreckage searching for their families. Women pulled children from collapsed buildings with their bare hands. Neighbors who had been trapped called out in the darkness, and neighbors who were able to move crawled toward the sounds of their voices. The rain continued to fall. The hail had stopped, but the storm system was still passing overhead. Lightning illuminated the destruction in brief, terrible flashes, and in those moments of light, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. There was nothing left. One rescuer who arrived from a neighboring town would later describe the scene with words that still haunt those who hear them. There were no lights, no nothing, and it was raining. In the darkness, dark as the inside of your hat, you could hear people screaming, moaning, calling for their families. My God, it was terrible. The town's water tower had been toppled, so there was no running water to fight fires or wash wounds. The few buildings that remained standing had no electricity. The only light came from car headlights and occasional flashes of lightning. Gradually, word began to spread to the surrounding communities. Motorists who had witnessed the tornado from the highway drove to the nearest towns to report what they had seen. Within an hour, the first vehicles began arriving from Winfield, 17 miles to the southeast. William Newton Hospital and St. Mary's Hospital in Winfield would receive more than 129 patients that night. Ambulances made trip after trip, carrying the wounded along dark country roads. Other victims were taken to St. Luke's Hospital in Wellington, 23 miles to the southwest, or to hospitals in Wichita to the northwest, But for many, help arrived too late. The bodies of the dead were collected and taken to makeshift morgues. Identification was difficult because personal belongings had been scattered for miles. Families who had lived next door to each other their entire lives now struggled to recognize what remained. The process of accounting for the missing would take days. In 1955, there was no centralized database of residents. There were no dental records for comparison. Identification often came down to clothing, jewelry, or the heartbreaking process of a family member viewing what was left. It is important to understand why this disaster was so devastating and why the loss of life was so immense. In 1955, the science of tornado forecasting was barely a decade old. Until the late 1930s, the word tornado itself was banned from all Weather Bureau reports. Officials worried that because forecasts covered such large areas, tornado warnings would unduly alarm the public. The fear was that false alarms would cause panic, accidents, and economic disruption. But by the 1950s, meteorologists were beginning to understand the weather conditions that spawned funnel clouds. They knew about supercells. They knew about wind shear. They knew about the unstable air masses that collided over Tornado Alley each spring. The problem was communication. On May 25, 1955, two separate severe weather warnings were issued for the area. The Storm Prediction Center in Kansas City recognized the threat, but the process of distributing that information was hopelessly inadequate. Warnings had to be sent by teletype from Kansas City to Denver, then relayed to local stations in Wichita. By the time the messages arrived, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The tornado had already destroyed Udall. Television was still in its infancy. Most stations did not employ meteorologists. They relied entirely on the Weather Bureau for their forecasts, and even when warnings were issued, there was no way to reach people who were already asleep or who did not have their televisions on. The 10 o'clock news that night had given the all-clear. The forecasters believed the storm threat had passed. Residents of Udall went to bed believing they were safe. They never had a chance. This failure would haunt the meteorological community for decades. How could a massive storm system spawn an F5 tornado that destroyed an entire town and nobody warned them? How could 82 people perish because the information did not arrive in time? The answer was simple and painful. The technology and systems needed to save those lives did not exist. Not yet. But they would. Because of Udall, they would. If this story is touching your heart right now, if you are feeling the weight of what these families endured, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment right now saying, "Their memory lives on." Because when you write those words, you are not just commenting on a video. You are joining a community of people who believe that every life matters, that every story deserves to be told, that the past should never be forgotten. Write it now. Their memory lives on. Chapter 4. The Long Night. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest in the history of Udall. As rescue efforts continued, the scope of the tragedy became clearer. Entire families had been wiped out. Houses had been swept from their foundations and deposited in fields hundreds of yards away. Personal possessions were scattered across the countryside, carried by the wind, to places miles from where they had been stored. The tornado had traveled more than 50 miles from the Oklahoma border before finally dissipating southeast of Wichita. Its path of destruction had been continuous, with only minor gaps. Weather surveyors who examined the damage in the following days confirmed that this was one of the most powerful tornadoes ever recorded in the state. But statistics meant nothing to the survivors. For 17-year-old Bobby Atkinson, the night was an endless journey through agony. He had crawled through the wreckage for hours, his broken body protesting every movement. Finally, nearly 7 hours after the tornado, he was found and taken to a hospital in Winfield. His injuries were catastrophic: fractured skull, broken ribs, 2 broken arms, and that wooden board still embedded in his back and chest, having punctured his lung. The doctors who treated him were amazed that he had survived the night. He would remain in the hospital for months. His recovery would be long and painful, and when he finally emerged, he would return to a town that had been forever changed and to a family that no longer existed. For the women who had attended the wedding shower, the night was a surreal mixture of terror and gratitude. They had survived, but many of the people they loved had not. In the darkness, they helped where they could, comforting the injured, searching for the missing, and praying for the dawn. Beth Evans would never forget the sound of the storm or the silence that followed. She would never forget the feeling of emerging from the community building into a world that no longer made sense, and she would carry the knowledge that she had been spared by a single decision. her mother's insistence that she stay for the party for the rest of her life. Aline Kistler would live with the memories for decades. 70 years later, she would still pack a bag with a change of clothes, her medicine, and a spare pair of shoes every time storms were predicted. The trauma of that night never fully faded. It became part of who she was. As the first light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, the true devastation became visible. The town of Udall was gone, not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone. Main Street, which had been the heart of the community, was now a wasteland of debris. The buildings that had lined the street, the grocery store where Gary Atkinson had sometimes helped his parents, the barbershop where men gathered to share news, the small cafe where farmers drank coffee on Saturday mornings, all of it had been reduced to rubble. The trees that had shaded the sidewalks were stripped bare, their branches torn away and scattered across the fields. They stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky, silent witnesses to what had occurred. And everywhere, scattered among the debris, were the remnants of ordinary lives. Photographs, clothing, kitchen utensils, toys, Bibles, the personal possessions that make a house a home, now scattered across the Kansas prairie like confetti after a parade. Search parties fanned out across the wreckage, looking for survivors who might still be trapped. They called out names. They listened for sounds of life beneath the rubble. And too often, they found only silence. The recovery of bodies continued throughout the day. Many were found in their beds, killed before they had a chance to wake up. Others were found in hallways, apparently trying to reach shelter when the tornado struck. Some were found far from their homes, carried by the wind to places where they did not belong. News of the disaster spread quickly. By mid-morning, reporters from Wichita radio and television stations had arrived. The local station, Keiki, was among the first on the scene. A young reporter named Greg Gamer drove into town and was confronted with devastation unlike anything he had ever seen. He described the scene with words that would be broadcast across the nation. Devastation, total devastation, with the trees all bare and the houses flattened. There were not more than 1 or 2 or 3 houses or buildings left standing. Cake's film footage was flown to Chicago and broadcast that night on all 3 major networks. Americans from coast to coast watched in horror as the images of Udall filled their television screens. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen the aftermath of a tornado. The new medium of television brought the tragedy into living rooms across the nation, and in doing so, it changed everything. The outpouring of support was immediate. Donations began arriving before the debris had been cleared. Volunteers from across Kansas and beyond headed toward Udall, determined to help in any way they could. But the damage had been done. 82 lives had been lost, an entire community had been torn apart, and the questions that needed to be answered could not wait. How did this happen? Why was there no warning? And what could be done to make sure it never happened again? Chapter 5. The Community That Refused to Break. In the days following the disaster, Udall became a destination for 2 very different groups of people. The first group came to help. Mennonite volunteers were among the first to arrive. They came from communities across Kansas, bringing tools, supplies, and the simple determination to serve those in need. They asked for nothing in return. They worked from dawn until dusk, clearing debris, salvaging what could be saved, and preparing the ground for rebuilding. The Red Cross established a relief station and began coordinating the distribution of food, clothing, and medical supplies. Army National Guard units were deployed to provide security and assist with the recovery effort. Utility crews worked around the clock to restore power and water to the areas that could still be served. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers became friends. The bonds that had held the community together before the tornado grew even stronger in its aftermath. But there was another group that came to Udall in those days, and their presence was far less welcome. They were the Gawkers. Hundreds of people drove from cities across the region to stare at the destruction. They came with cameras. They came with picnic baskets. They parked along the roads into town and walked among the rubble, pointing and photographing, treating the worst tragedy in Kansas history as if it were a tourist attraction. For the survivors, it was almost unbearable. They had lost their homes. They had lost their loved ones. They had lost everything that made their lives worth living. And now strangers were walking through the debris of their lives, snapping pictures and exclaiming over the destruction as if it were entertainment. The National Guard eventually had to establish checkpoints to control access to the town. Only residents and authorized personnel were allowed to enter. The Gawkers were turned away, their curiosity unsatisfied, but the damage to the collective psyche of Udall's survivors was already done. The trauma of the tornado was compounded by the trauma of being turned into a spectacle. Many residents would never speak publicly about that night for years afterward. The pain was too deep, the memories too raw. In the weeks that followed, the question of whether to rebuild became the central focus of the community. Some argued that it was time to leave. The tornado had proven that Udall was vulnerable. What was to stop another storm from destroying whatever was rebuilt? Why invest time and money and emotion into a place that nature itself seemed determined to erase? But others disagreed. This was their home. Their families had lived here for generations. Their children were buried in the local cemetery. Their memories were woven into every street corner, every building, every patch of Kansas soil. They would rebuild, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because Udall was part of who they were. And they refused to let a tornado take that away. The decision was made. Udall would rise again. The rebuilding process was slow and difficult. Insurance claims had to be filed and fought over. Building permits had to be obtained. Construction materials had to be sourced. And all of this had to be done while the survivors were still grieving, still healing, still trying to make sense of what had happened. But gradually the town began to take shape again. New homes were built on the same lots where the old ones had stood. The school was reconstructed, better and stronger than before. Churches were rebuilt, their steeples rising once again toward the Kansas sky. And in the center of town, a small park was established. At its heart stood a gray stone monument inscribed with 77 names, the official count at the time of those who had been lost on that terrible night. The monument remains to this day, a quiet reminder of the price that Udall paid. The survivors carried their trauma with them, but they also carried something else: resilience, the stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances beyond their control. Beth Evans and Aline Kistler remained in Udall. They grew up together, grew old together, and remained friends for more than 7 decades. When asked why they stayed, they always gave the same answer: this is home. The community that emerged from the disaster was different from the one that had existed before. It was smaller. Many families had moved away, unable to bear the memories or unwilling to risk another catastrophe. But those who remained were bound together by an experience that only they could truly understand. They had faced the worst that nature could throw at them. They had lost almost everything, and they had chosen to stay, to rebuild, to continue. That choice, perhaps more than anything else, defined who they were. Chapter 6. The Legacy That Saved Thousands. The tornado that destroyed Udall on May 25th, 1955, was not just a local tragedy. It was a turning point in the history of weather forecasting and disaster response in America. In the aftermath of the disaster, difficult questions were asked at the highest levels of government. How could a tornado of this magnitude strike a populated area with no warning? Why did the existing systems fail so completely? And what needed to change to prevent such a tragedy from happening again? The answers led to a revolution in how America prepared for severe weather. Within months of the Udall disaster, the Weather Bureau began implementing new procedures for tornado warnings. The cumbersome process of relaying information through multiple stations was streamlined. Local forecasters were given more authority to issue warnings directly to their communities without waiting for approval from regional offices. Television and radio stations were required to interrupt regular programming to broadcast severe weather alerts. The concept of the tornado watch, indicating conditions favorable for tornado development, and the tornado warning, indicating that a tornado had been spotted or detected on radar, was formalized and widely publicized. The technology of weather radar was improved and expanded. New radar installations were built across Tornado Alley, providing earlier and more accurate detection of severe storms. The primitive systems of 1955 gave way to increasingly sophisticated equipment capable of identifying the rotation within supercells that often preceded tornado formation. And perhaps most importantly, the culture of tornado awareness began to change. Before Udall, many people in tornado-prone areas had a fatalistic attitude towards severe weather. Tornadoes were seen as random acts of nature, impossible to predict or prepare for. When a storm came, you hoped for the best and dealt with the consequences afterward. After Udall, that attitude began to shift. Communities across the Midwest installed warning sirens and developed emergency response plans. Schools began conducting tornado drills. Families identified safe rooms in their homes and stocked them with emergency supplies. The lessons learned at Udall were written into building codes and emergency management protocols. They influenced the training of meteorologists and first responders for generations. They saved countless lives in the decades that followed. Consider the comparison that historians often make. In 2007, a massive tornado struck the town of Greensburg, Kansas. Like the Udall tornado, it was rated F5, the most powerful classification. Like the Udall tornado, it struck at night, when people were most vulnerable. And like the Udall tornado, it essentially destroyed the entire town. But the outcome was very different. In Greensburg, 11 people perished. In Udall, 82, the difference was warning. The residents of Greensburg had 20 minutes of advance notice that a tornado was approaching. They had time to reach shelters. They had time to take cover. They had time to survive. That warning was possible because of the systems that were developed in the aftermath of Udall, the radar that detected the storm, the communications network that spread the alert, the culture of preparedness that encouraged people to take the warnings seriously. The 82 people who perished in Udall did not die in vain. Their tragedy became the catalyst for changes that have protected millions of Americans in the decades since. Bobby Atkinson, the 17-year-old who lost his entire family and nearly lost his own life, eventually recovered from his physical wounds. The emotional scars never fully healed. How could they? But he lived. He married. He had children of his own, and he shared his story with anyone who wanted to hear it, hoping that by keeping the memory alive, he could help prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. Mary Ellen Taylor, the telephone operator who stayed at her post until the end, became a symbol of dedication and sacrifice. She could have fled. She could have sought shelter. Instead, she remained at her switchboard, trying to warn others, trying to connect calls for help, trying to do her job until the very last second. Her sacrifice was not forgotten. Gary Atkinson, the 12-year-old paperboy who had ridden his bicycle down the streets of Udall for the last time on May 25, 1955, lives on in the memories of those who knew him and in the pages of books written about that terrible night. He was just a boy doing what boys do, living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. His story reminds us that disasters do not discriminate. They do not spare the young or the innocent. They do not check whether their victims have plans for the future or dreams yet to be fulfilled. They simply destroy. And it is up to those who survive to find meaning in the destruction. Today, 70 years after the tornado, Udall is a small bedroom community to Wichita. It is a quiet place, with tree-lined streets and modest homes. The population is smaller than it was in 1955, but the spirit of the town remains. Every year on the anniversary of the disaster, the community gathers to remember. They lay flowers at the monument in the park. They share stories of those who were lost. They remind each other and the world that what happened here mattered. Beth Evans and Aline Kistler, the teenage girls who survived the wedding shower, are now in their 80s. They still live in Udall. They still complete each other's sentences when they speak. They still carry the memories of that night, and they still believe that sharing their story is important. If this celebration saves one life of someone else to take cover at the correct time, they have said, then I think that is the blessing. The story of Udall is the story of America. It is a story of tragedy and resilience, of loss and renewal, of darkness and the dawn that follows. It is a reminder that nature is powerful beyond our comprehension, but that human beings are powerful too. Not in our ability to prevent disaster, but in our ability to survive it, to rebuild, to remember, to move forward while never forgetting where we have been. The sky fell over Kansas on May 25, 1955. An entire town was erased in 3 minutes. 82 souls were taken before their time, but Udall did not disappear. The people who survived refused to let it disappear. They rebuilt their homes and their lives. They raised their children and told their stories. They created systems and technologies that would protect future generations. And they reminded us all that even in the darkest moments, when the world seems to have been torn apart beyond repair, there is always hope. There is always tomorrow. There is always the chance to begin again. The night the sky fell over Kansas was the night that America learned how fragile our lives truly are. But it was also the night that America learned how strong we can be when we face tragedy together. Remember Udall. Remember the names on that gray stone monument. Remember the telephone operator who stayed at her post. Remember the paperboy who never delivered another newspaper. Remember the families who lost everything and chose to rebuild anyway. Remember them, because their story is our story too. And if you have watched this far, it is because you understand why these stories matter. So I want to ask you to do something. Check if you are subscribed to this channel. If you are not, please hit that subscribe button now. Every subscription helps us continue to tell these important stories, to honor the memories of those who have been forgotten by history, and to remind the world that the past still has lessons to teach us. Leave a comment below. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far." Just those 4 words, so I can get to know you and know who really loves the stories on this channel. Your comment means more than you know. Hit the like button. It takes less than a second, but it helps this video reach more people who need to hear these stories, more people who will remember Udall, more people who will carry these memories forward. And share this video. Share it with your friends, your family, anyone who appreciates history told with heart, because stories like this deserve to be shared. They deserve to be heard. They deserve to live on. The people of Udall faced the unimaginable and survived. They rebuilt their community and their lives. They turned tragedy into legacy. Now it is our turn to honor that legacy. Subscribe, comment, like, share, and remember, because as long as we remember, they are never truly gone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, the sky may fall, but we will rise.